Okay. All right. We should be recording. So thank you all for coming tonight to listen about uh, vermicomposting. So we have all sorts of different methods of composting. I practice several here at my house. I have chickens, and they get my greens and other vegetables and things like that from my kitchen. Sometimes I'll give them leftovers that maybe are a few days past what I would eat, but they're still good for the birds. And then I have sometimes rotten stuff, and the worms get that. They love that. And then a lot of times I'll have a separate compost bin that I put in plants and things like that. So there's all sorts of different ways to compost. Today, we're just going to talk about vermicomposting, about worms. I keep a bin of worms on my porch, and they're kind of fun and multitasking. My family occasionally will use them for fishing. So they're kind of nice to have around. My daughter also has an axolotl, so she'll feed some of those worms to her axolotl sometimes. And if you are an entrepreneur, you can also think about maybe having some of those worms making some money for you by selling them. So let's move on in and we'll talk a little bit about composting in general. So most people are probably going to know kind of what composting is, but that's going to basically be a natural process of kind of making organic matter, be it your kitchen scraps like carrot peelings or celery tops, eggshells, and other stuff like that, mixing that all together and allowing it to naturally break down and form a very rich humus or soil that you can then put back to your plants. That'll add some nutrients and add some texture to the soil. Black gold, that's kind of a compost. It's going to be very rich in nutrients, generally used for gardening, horticulture, or agriculture. So that would be something like black cow that you can get in the bags. That's composted cow manure and very, very rich, but you can make your own, which is kind of nice. So it'll save you a little bit of money. So what's in compost? Well, if you're going to have a compost pile, be it any type of compost pile, you're probably going to want to have greens and browns. So you're going to have um, both of those essentially, because you need to have those two working together. You've got to have the nitrogens, you've got to have the liquid or the moisture that goes with the greens, and it's all got to work together to decompose along with the little organisms that are in there to give you that good compost. So that's going to be like leaves, straw, wood. So if you had a stump ground up, that would be good. Grass from your front lawn, vegetable scraps from your kitchen, and combine those along with water and just the general the air that's out there. You're going to be turning that pile, and temperatures, the high temperatures that you're going to get from the thermophiles or the little bacteria that inhabit those piles, that's going to create the environment for that material to kind of break down and decompose to form that really rich humus. So here's a list of some things that would fall under the brown and the green category. So for brown materials, it's essentially what you think it is. It's going to be like cardboard, maybe oat straw, um, shredded leaves. Like if you're raking your leaves, in the fall and you pile those up. Sawdust, that's another good one. Chipped wood, all that takes a little bit longer. Cardboard egg cartons, shredded paper towels, toilet paper rolls, wood ash, but not coal, and that in moderation because it can change pH, dried grass, things like that. So basically stuff that's already kind of dried up. And then for green materials, vegetable trimmings, algae, if you have a pond and you've raked that out, green leaves, grass clippings, kelp or seaweed if you live near the ocean, green shrub prunings, not diseased. We want to make a point of saying if there's any kind of a disease organism on it, like a fungal organism or something like that, we don't want that in there. Tea bags, alfalfa, hay or meal if you have horses, coffee grounds in moderation, animal manure in moderation, house plants if you just don't want to have them anymore, weeds without the seed heads because you don't want to inoculate that pile with those weed seeds. Maybe old flower bouquets. Not a fan of the human hair thing. I think you can, do other things with that in aquarium water because there's a lot of nutrients in there. So, there's a lot of different things that'll fall into those categories and other stuff that's not mentioned here, but you kind of get the idea. So what's in compost? Well, what's doing the heavy lifting here? Those are going to be microorganisms. So you've got everything from little tiny minute bacteria. You've got some tardigrades there. You've got earthworms, insects, fungi, all sorts of stuff, everything in there. Now, I'm not going to go into the specifics of everything that's in there, but just know it's a lot. I have other presentations where I dive a little deeper into those particular organisms that work in the compost pile. But yeah, it's a lot and a lot of different types of bacteria. So just know that it's a very complex process to get that pile of old trimmings and things broken down. So benefits. Well, if you garden a lot, whether it's vegetable or if it's ornamental, it doesn't really matter. Here in Georgia, we have kind of what I would consider poor topsoil. There's a lot of clay in it, and it's very, very heavy. Clay is a good additive in moderation, but you also have to have some sand and then the organic matter, and all those mixed together are going to provide you a pretty decent soil. But unfortunately, most of us are not blessed with that combination of items in our soil. So we have to kind of make that. And we can do that by adding organic matter. So instead of going out and buying a huge bag of soil 3, which can be kind of expensive, you can make your own compost. So it's going to improve that soil fertility by allowing the roots to grow through that, providing that organic matter to loosen up that heavy clay. It's going to add some nutrients back into the soil. Lots of benefits for that. Recycling, reducing waste, that's all good. It's going to help retain water in that soil because it's going to soak up any of that rain. So that's good for your plants. Reducing landfill waste, always a good thing. Can't beat that. You're going to store some carbon through sequestration, and it's going to reduce personal food waste. My daughter's off at college now, but when we were a family of 4, routinely, because of all of that composting that I was doing with my chickens and my worms and my bin, and then the recycling that I do with plastics and other stuff, I think we would routinely have maybe a bag or maybe 2 bags of trash for a whole week, which is pretty good. So if you can get it down to that, that's a great thing. So you're going to turn that waste into those usable organic nutrients. So you can kind of see here, I'm not going to dive in there too deep, but you can kind of read food, others, containers, packaging, yard trimmings, durable goods. That's what your garbage is typically made of. So you can also see her landfill and other recycled, composted. So those numbers, that composted number, and especially in larger cities, goes up every year because they've got programs where, you get 2 bins. Like I have Southern Sanitation here at my house. I have a 95-gallon trash bin. I also have a 95-gallon recycle bin. I typically fill that up every week, and I don't fill up the trash. So that's a good thing. That means that the landfills that we do have a little bit more capacity and time. So, other than the things that I mentioned before, which is improving soil texture and all of that, helping your heavier soils, it's a mild, slow release natural fertilizer. So for those that are doing organics, that's a good benefit. It's not obviously as powerful as some of the other types of fertilizers that are out there, but you can't discount it. And so by using that, you're going to reduce a lot of the runoff into rivers and streams. So again, not too bad, definitely good. And, definitely something I think we should all look at doing. So again, just gonna kind of speed through this. Got a lot of information to cover, but I mentioned that we're seeing an increase in composting programs. I know that Kim Fritz, my um, colleague, works in the schools. They have a lot of composting programs in the schools here in Gwinnett County, and that is fantastic. So the kids are learning that composting is a wonderful thing, and I think that everybody should do it to some point, at least if they can in their house. So you can see here 65 increase in composting programs worldwide in the last 5 years. That's pretty impressive in my book. Um, and there's 185 composting facilities in the US. Most of them going to be private owned, but if you can get the government ones in there, that's good too. And new businesses, you can sustain 18 full-time jobs. Does anybody remember Mike Rowe and his Dirty Jobs show? That's back on. And I bet you he'd probably have some of those jobs on his Dirty Jobs show, because it's probably not clean, but it's good for the environment, and that's a good thing. So there are different types of composting, and this is not an exhaustive list. There are actually other types as well, but these are the ones that we're going to practice the most around here, and that's going to be cold or passive composting, hot or active composting, and then vermicomposting. So the cold or passive composting, that's basically where you just throw it in a pile and forget about it, and you're not really doing anything with it. The active composting, you're actually going out there and turning the pile. You might be adding water, things of that nature. So here, this kind of breaks it down a little bit more. Mostly anaerobic. You're not really doing a whole lot to it. It just sits there. So you may have multiple bins in a row, and after a period of time, you may shovel it over into another bin and start filling up another one. But it takes a while. It can take several years if you're not actively managing it. If you're doing active composting, it's a lot faster. You can have actual usable, good, humusy organic matter in like 6 months, maybe less, if you're really, really working at it. This is where you have I usually tell people you've got to have it about 3 foot high by about 3 foot wide. And what you're going to do is you're aiming to get that center to have those thermophiles, or that bacteria that's going to be in that center. They're going to reach those temperatures up to about 160 degrees. So that's going to start breaking stuff down. So I think 4 weeks, if you chop everything up, and there are some of those little countertop compost machines, they're really expensive, like $500. You could probably end up with compost in 4 weeks. I know they say earlier than that, but you've got to really work at it. So there is a program called Master Composter. And so those folks really work hard at knowing all of the information that you need to know on how to do that. But basically, keeping those carbon and nitrogen in the optimum ratios, balancing that air and water, making sure that that pile is in a good spot, and that you're constantly working it so that you do get that stuff to break down quickly, and then you can use that for your plants. So vermiculture, well, let's dive into the worms. That's going to just be the generalized culture of earthworms. So if you're wanting to get into that business and you want to do it on a bigger scale, that's basically just growing earthworms. Anytime you see that word culture on the back of a word, it's probably growing something. So aquaculture, growing fish, vermiculture, growing worms. And the goal is that you really want to keep increasing that number of worms. So if you're selling the worms for fish bait, or you're selling the worms for composting, doesn't really matter. You're just trying to make sure that they're breeding, that you can get more worms. Vermicomposting is going to be how you're using those worms. So you're going to convert organic materials or waste from your kitchen and your household into something called vermicompost, which is what those worms are going to eat and then secrete. And then you're getting the leftovers after they eat that stuff. And over time, when that breaks down and all, because it can, there's several different forms, and we'll go through that. It's going to give you this odorless, kind of nutrient rich casting in about 3 to 6 months, depending on the size of your worm container. And it's great for plants. So we'll learn a little bit more about that. Oops. So the value, well, like I mentioned before, and I like to reiterate, you get rid of a lot of stuff in your house. They can do paper too. Lots of stuff in the gardens. I mean, I know if you have a compost heap out by your garden, you're always going to find earthworms in there. They're one of the things that help break down that pile. Um, so you definitely want to continue to enhance, I guess, that in your garden areas. So this just kind of gives you an idea of what the worm castings or the worm poo will do if added into the crops. So these are just some little experiments that were done by UGA students. And you can see that in the potting mix, just the Georgia red clay in the middle, and this is, I'm looking at to the left, and then the one on the right, the tomato plants that had worm castings or were grown in the worm castings, there's a lot of difference there. That's a significant difference, a statistically significant difference. Those plants are double the size. So you can visually look at it and see, oh, wow, yeah, there's a lot of difference. Those plants grew 3 times faster. You can also look at the corn and in this raised bed, and you can see that it is definitely much happier than the corn grown in the section that did not have that. So that should just give you an idea of what they can do for what the worm castings can do for your plants. And here's some crops. So you can also see that small turnip there on the left. It didn't have any vermicompost used, medium 10% larger, large turnip 20%. So if you're adding in those that vermicompost or worm tea or another byproduct from the worms, you're definitely going to get a big bump up in size and the volume. So just some information on worms. So, we all know there's different worms out there, but a lot of people aren't aware that there's over 9,000 different species of earthworms. And the only group of earthworms identifying as epigeic are suitable for vermicomposting. And that basically just means they're going to live in that top little layer of topsoil, which is very minimal here in Georgia. We don't have a lot of topsoil. They don't burrow down in the ground. There are other types of worms that do burrow down. There are some that will burrow down and also live up on the top. But the only ones that we're really interested in are the ones that live in that top layer because they're going to deposit their castings on the surface. So the most common worm that's used in vermicomposting is going to be the red wiggler worm. Or the Acinia fetida, because it's kind of stinky. Like that is stinky. So look for those. And I will tell you, so you can go out to Walmart or you can go out to a bait shop and ask them if they carry red wigglers. I will tell you, the red wigglers they have are typically not the same worm that we use here in composting, vermicomposting. So you can go on to Amazon because you can buy anything from Amazon, and you can actually buy true red wiggler, the Acinia fetida worms on Amazon. And they just get shipped to you in a container, a worm container on ice. And those are going to be your best bet if you don't have somebody that you know that has worms. So just, don't just go for the ones that you can get at the bait shop is, I guess, the point there. Earthworms are going to prefer moisture that's going to be between 60 to 85%. So about 80%. So that means that whatever bedding you use has to be pretty moist. You got to watch it. You don't want it to get too moist, and you also don't want it to get too dry. You'll lose your worms, they'll die. So you need to monitor them in whatever container that you have. The ideal temperature is going to be about 70 degrees. But they can tolerate a range of like 40 to 90 degrees. So my worms are on my porch. It's a convenient location to where my kitchen is. And generally speaking, unless the temperatures drop below about 35, they live on my porch all year round, even when it is super hot. Now, when it gets colder than that, I'll actually move them into my garage and I'll put them on something where they're raised above the concrete area, just so that they don't have to get into like 20 or 10 degrees. You'll lose a lot of worms. Not all of them will die, but you'll lose a lot of them. The other thing you need to know is be careful about maintaining the pH fairly neutral. So, some of the things, and we'll go over some of the things that you should feed them and some of the things you shouldn't feed them. Citrus being one of them, that can drop the pH. They're not real fond of it anyway, but you need to make sure that you aim for all of these particular ranges for moisture and temperature and pH, because that's where your worms are going to be happiest, and that's how you're going to get the most reproduction. All right, so how do you get more worms? Good question. So red wigglers and most earthworms are going to be hermaphrodites. That means that they have both male and female organs. So what they're going to do is, I'm sure a lot of us have dissected worms when we were in high school, and you probably remember that real thick raised section there is the clatella. So they're going to line those up side by side, and they're going to release a lot of mucus. It's pretty disgusting. That's going to cover both of those bands. And then when they wriggle out of that band, they're going to create this little cocoon. They're going to lay their eggs in there, and they're going to that mucus is then going to harden into a cocoon, and that's going to be there around those eggs to protect them. So the egg sac is going to be about the size of a grain of rice. So you can see down there in the lower left, there's a quarter in there for size. And you can see they're just these little circular egg sacs, and they're going to start out as white, and then they're kind of darken down into brown. And that color change also gives you an idea of how close it is to hatching. And when it gets to brown, that's basically when those worms are going to hatch. So it takes about 3 weeks. It's somewhat temperature dependent. So you're going to get more generations if it's warmer. So obviously, if you don't do a whole lot with them over the winter time, you're probably going to lose some. But then in the summertime, they're going to be happier. As long as you're feeding them, you're going to get a population that's going to double, every 10 days or so. So over the course of the 3 months or so of summer, when it's the warmest, you could end up with, quite a few more, and you can then give them to your friends or family, whatever. It really depends on what your goals are. Those cocoons are going to have about 10 eggs, but really only about half that, somewhere in there, are going to actually survive. And you can tell that when you go out there and you start poking around in your bin, and you'll see the really itty bitty worms, and those are the recent ones that have emerged. But basically, you could have, if you have a small bin or a small box, you can have up to 1,000 baby worms every 6 months. And again, then those will reproduce, and then those will reproduce. A lot of worms. So what if you see these white worms? Okay, well, so even the little bitty red wigglers are still going to be red. So if you see these white worms, they are not baby red wigglers. Those are called pot worms. They are relatives of earthworms, but what that's going to tell me is that your pH is off and your moisture content is off. So I mentioned they need to be happy. So you got to have the moisture content in that narrow range. You got to have that temperature, and you have to have that pH. So sometimes we throw a lot of extra stuff in there. We're overfeeding the worms. The moisture content gets too high, and the pH might be off. And so you might see some of these guys. They're not going to hurt your worms, but they do compete directly for food. So you really don't want them in there, and try your best to keep those conditions as close to what the past slide said: 60 to 80% humidity, temperature about 70 degrees, and the pH about 7. Keep that as close as you can. So potential issues, I mentioned that: acidic, too wet, putting too much stuff in there. Things to fix it: fairly easy. Add some type of carbon, and that can be cardboard. So you can rip cardboard up. You can take paper. So if you got a paper shredder, shred some of that paper up. That's going to soak that moisture and take it out of there. Don't feed them as much. So if you have a tiny bin, you don't want to keep dumping rotten tomatoes in there. Get a bigger bin. Stop doing that vegetable scraps. Put that in a regular compost bin. and get rid of the fermenting food. You may want to aerate those soil. You can also add crushed eggshells, and that's going to help neutralize a little bit of that acidity. And that's because that's calcium. All right, so let's move on. We're going to talk about habitats. So how do we house these worms? So we'll talk a little bit about the different type of worm boxes, how to make your own, and towers, things like that. And then we'll kind of move on to what the products are, the byproducts are from the worms. So a DIY worm box, I mean, it can be as simpler as you want. It could just be one bin. I just have one simple plastic bin that I keep my worms in with a piece of like 4 or 6 mil black plastic over the top of it to help keep the moisture in. And my worms are perfectly happy. It doesn't need anything fancy. But you could get 3 to 4 plastic tubs or bins, drill some holes in there, and get your shredded newspaper, put a little faucet thing on the front. I mean, you can get really fancy. So that how you do that, you're going to take 2 or 3 of those tubs and you're going to drill holes like you see here. Pretty quick, very easy. And then you're going to put some small cups or something like that. That's basically going to hold one of those bins up away from that leachate that you see there in the bin that's going to be on the bottom. So you want something to raise that bin up off of, and then that leachate's going to drip down through those holes and collect in the bin underneath. And that leachate actually can make you some nice worm tea. So we'll talk about that in a bit too. So this is kind of how it works. And you put the bedding material up in the top. You're drilling holes there for the worms, for air. You've got that active area. You've got the area where you're collecting the compost. And then you've got the drippings that are going to drip all the way down through. And if you want to put a little tap in there, you can do that, or just deconstruct it and pull it out and dump the worm tea off, whichever is easier for you. But that's basically how it works. And you can get fancier. You can make your own. This one looks like a little food dehydrator, but it is not a food dehydrator. But you can keep this one. It's cute. You can keep it on your porch or in your garage. Here's some other fancy ones. So, I mean, you can get as fancy as you want to here. A couple $100 for some of these, probably $50 for others. Oops. And then this is the kind of stuff that you're going to use for worm bedding. So I personally use peat moss in mine. You can use coconut coir. You can use dry dead leaves if you have a lot of trees, because they'll break those down. Commercial bedding, I don't know why you would probably use that unless you had a lot of it. You can use corrugated cardboard, shred it up, shred that paper up, and use that. Perfectly fine. Wood shavings, you can use hay or straw. Apparently, I like commercial bedding because I put that in there twice. I didn't catch that. Things to remember, about 50% of that bedding is probably going to be used as food. So you have to, whatever you have in there, those worms have to be able to eat that and to break that down. So the smaller the pieces of whatever you put in there, specifically the cardboard or the shredded paper, it really does need to be shredded because they're going to eat that. Make sure that it's in very small pieces. You got to keep it aerated. You can't let it get saturated. Those worms have to breathe. So if you remember, when it rains and a lot, and that soil gets saturated and you see all those poor little worms on the sidewalk, that's the same thing that can happen here. So you want to make sure that you keep that moisture content in that 60 to 80% so that they can breathe. And you've got to be continuous. So sometimes it's as simple as you just get a cup of water and you run it around the edge. If you're using that peat moss, it will move through the peat moss. Or sometimes if you're just putting in, produce that's overripe and has a lot high moisture content, that will help keep it nice and moist. But just keep an eye on it is I guess what I'm trying to say. So my favorite is going to be peat moss, but I've also used that shredded coconut coir mixed with the paper. So I have a paper shredder and it's super easy. You can also mix that peat moss with that paper and the worms will eat that. So just as long as it's just regular old printer paper, newspaper, something like that, you don't want to use the color section, the glossy stuff. Don't use that. But you can definitely use printer paper. Most ink these days is going to be a soy based, so it's perfectly fine to use. But either one of these are my favorites and fairly easy to find, fairly cheap to get to also. So you can see here, this is what it looks like when you mix it up. It's still dry here, but yeah, you just add some water, a little bit of water to that to kind of moisten it up. And the worms really like that. So what do worms eat? Well, good question. I mentioned that they're not a big fan of citrus. They aren't a fan either of garlic or onion. So, keep those out of the worm compost bin. You can toss those into your regular compost if you want to do that. A lot of times it'll take longer to break down, but generally speaking, whatever you would throw into your compost bin, excluding, and we'll talk about some of the things they don't like I said, you can give it to your worms. So vegetables, any type of vegetable matter, leaves, of course, yard waste, eggshells, crunch those eggshells up, paper, shredded, tea bags, coffee grounds, fruit, all of that stuff is fair game. Don't feed meat, dairy, citrus, as I mentioned. Anything that's sauces, don't give that. Oils, foods with preservatives, spicy foods, bread that can attract gnats, pet waste, or pasta. There is a time and a place where you can compost pet waste and some of that stuff. This is not where you're going to do that. If you have your worms outside, not to say that they won't eat some of that, but for the same reasons you wouldn't put it in your regular compost bin, it attracts nuisance wildlife. You can attract insects and other things that you don't want there. It stinks, it oozes. Yeah, most of that is going to be the reason, well, for me anyway, stinkiness and that kind of thing. I don't want that in my house. I have them sitting out there. I can't smell them in the summertime. Even when I give them rotten stuff, I don't smell that. But I bet you would if you had rancid meat or rancid dairy or oils that had spoiled, you would definitely smell that. So just keep that out of the worm bin. So here's a nice little infographic. You can find these all over the internet. Yummy, yucky, it's cute, and it's an easy way to pictorially see what worms do and don't like. So for instance, if you buy yourself a little worm bin and you want to bring your kids and loop them in or your grandkids, find one of these on the internet, print it off, laminate it, and stick it on the tower. That way, if they want to go feed the worms, they know what belongs and what doesn't belong because it's pictorially there. So even if they don't read yet, they can see what the picture is. You can always say no or yes. Most kids can recognize that. But something like this around the house, just for those non-expert composters, is probably a good thing to have. That way everybody can contribute and they all know what works and what doesn't. These buttons are very touchy. So feeding examples. As I mentioned, worms love rotting tomatoes. It's kind of gross, but you put those in there and pop a couple holes in them and within hours you've got this writhing mass of worms around these. They just love rotten tomatoes. I don't know why that is, but they just do. Rotting bananas, either way, you have to make sure that they have a way to get into whatever it is that you're putting there. So in the case of a tomato, you can cut a slit in it. Same thing with the rotten banana. Other stuff, if you've got a bag of coleslaw, that's generally going to be shredded enough that they can, get into it. But an apple or something like that, make sure that you're cutting a slit in it somehow so that the worms can get into the interior and start working on the rotted stuff. So keeping portions small or cut up or easier for them to get into, that's the smart thing to do. So again, grind, puree, shred, freeze. I don't know too many people that are going to go so far as pureeing something for the worms to eat, but if you can rip it up or shred it, that's a good thing. So, what kind of things are you going to get from the worms? Well, that's a good question. Most people know about the worm castings. You can buy those a lot of places online. Sometimes you might be able to buy them at some of the garden stores. And Amazon, you can buy anything on Amazon. A little tiny bag is like $35. So that tells you right there. And you saw the pictures, they can grow stuff, I mean, 3 times the size without something that you were growing without them. So you're going to get worm castings, which is the worm poo, and you can see a little pile of those. They shouldn't smell, but they're, like I said, a good additive to your container pots and or in bed, raised beds, whichever. You're going to get that leachate, which is going to be what you see there that drips down through your worm tower and collects in the bottom. And then worm tea. And that's going to be basically if you soak those worm castings and aerate it. And then you can buy you see the little bottle there on the left. That's going to be a concentrate of worm tea. And you can make that. I have a recipe for it on here. So, how do you get that good stuff out? Well, lots of different methods here, whatever method you want to do. So, whatever your bin is, you can use the vertical or light method. So that's basically going to be piling all of that stuff up into a volcano. And then you're going to take a light bulb, maybe you have a desk lamp or something, or you have a warming lamp. You're going to hold that, you're going to put that down over the top of that volcano. So it's up at the top. Worms are photophobic. They don't like light. So they're going to move down through that volcano away from that light. So over about 15 minutes, you're going to go over there and give them time to migrate down, then take that portion and move that away to a different bin. And keep doing that until you're down to the bottom of the bin where you just have mostly a thick layer of worms and you've removed most of that upper layer of the castings. And so most people, you get to understand what it looks like after they've been in that material, either the coconut coir or whatever you have them in for bedding material. You'll see what it looks like and you'll be like, okay, I got to get the worms out of there. So you're just going to you're going to visually be able to look at that and tell. You can do a bait separation method also. So you're going to take that bin that you have and you're going to push all of that old used, bedding material with the worm castings in off to one side, and then you're going to get new bedding material and you're going to put it in the other side. And then you're going to take some of their favorite foods like rotten tomatoes and put it in the new stuff. And so all those worms that are in the old side are going to migrate to the new side. So give it a day or so and then go over there and shovel out the old stuff. So that's a good way to do it too. You can do a screen sorting method. So you can buy hardware cloth at Ace Hardware, or you can buy it online in smaller sheets. Make yourself a little frame, attach that hardware cloth to it. You're going to use a 1/4 inch or an 8-inch hardware cloth. Usually that 8-inch, 1/8 of an inch hardware cloth is, much smaller. It's going to do a better job of sorting out the castings and leaving the worms and the egg casings behind. And you're going to then just basically, like you're panning for gold, you're going to sort out all the worms and you're going to dump them into the bin, and then you're left with the castings. And then if you're really just like to have your fingers in there, you can dump it out on a tarp and sort it out, and just get the worms and the egg castings out, and then whatever, or the egg casings, and then whatever's left is what you can use for your garden. So this is what worm castings look like. A little bit like mouse turds. But it's a good soil additive. You can use it just by itself as a soilless mix in a container garden, or you can make that worm tea that I was talking about. And basically you're just going to soak these. And again, I'll have a recipe in a bit, or you can buy it on Amazon. So with the castings as a soil additive, you're basically just, you're going to get a bag of them if you buy them that way, or if you collect them yourself, take a handful and put that in the hole when you're planting the plant. That'll give it a nice little boost and help the roots get established and then the plant to grow. If you're propagating seeds, you can mix them in the seed raising mix that you are putting your seeds in. So it's 2 parts of the coconut coir to 1 part worm castings. You can use it as a soil conditioner and just kind of scrape it through the soil. Before you're mulching, spread a very thin layer over the top of your landscape plants and then put your mulch over the top of that. And as it rains and that soaks down through, those nutrients will help your plants. And for container plants, you can put about 25% castings and 75% potting soil. So as you're planting things, just do a 25 to 75 mix. So as a soilless mix, that's going to be 40% castings. This is assuming you have a lot of worms, which out at the UGA garden, they have these big bins that are like, I don't know, 15 feet long by 4 foot wide. So maybe twice the length of a raised bed and about the same width. And they have lids that you can flip up and they just bring all sorts of stuff from the farm out and dump it in there and mix that in with the worms. And then they have this huge crank machine that has the 1/8 of an inch hardware cloth, and the worms and the egg casings fall out and the go out the one side, and then all of the castings fall through, and then they'll use that for whatever on the farm. But 40% castings, 30% perlite, and 30% vermiculite. And you use that as a soilless mix. So you can use that in your containers. Worm tea, I mentioned that you can use that leachate, or sorry, not the leachate. You can use the worm castings, and then you're going to kind of make this little fermented concoction. So it's a fertilizer, and you're going to use dechlorinated water, or you can just purchase jugs of it, or if you want to get your jugs, leave them out in the sun to allow the chlorine to kind of break down. You need about 10 gallons of water, so that's a couple 5-gallon buckets. You're going to get a pound of those worm castings in some type of a mesh bag, like pantyhose or cheesecloth or something like that. And then you're going to wrap that up. You can kind of see there in that bucket. Drop those in a 5-gallon bucket and cover about half with the water. You're going to add in some molasses, honey, or another natural sugar. And then you put a bubbler in there and let it go for about 2 days, 48 hours. And so you're going to you're allowing it to kind of ferment and make that fertilizer, and then mix with the remaining water. And then you can use that to water your container plants or your garden plants or whatever. If you don't want to do all that, you can just buy it on Amazon. But sometimes people love to make their own things. It's not hard to do at all. So this is the recipe. Leachate. So that's again the liquid that kind of drains through when you have your worms. And we don't really know everything that's in there. So, it may or may not have some bad microorganisms. I don't know. But you have to dilute it either way. You can see it. It looks like molasses. It's not molasses. But you want to use the fresh stuff. So if you're going to have your worms, make sure that you're continually removing that stuff, mixing it up, and then putting it out on your garden. So it's going to be better to aerate it if you're going to use it regularly. But again, that's another byproduct of using your worms as composters. You don't want to let that go to waste. You can definitely use that in your vegetable or ornamental garden. So worms do better when you don't love them too much. Sometimes I get people that'll come into the extension office and they'll want a soil test or something else, and they love their plants to death. They put fertilizer on them every single growing season. They add lime, whether it needs it or not. And then when things don't look really good and their plants are not very happy and they just don't know what they're doing anymore because they're doing all the right things, they think, they come in for a test. Well, then we find out you've put too much lime on and your pH is now 9. We might find out that all of the macro or the micronutrients or the macronutrients that are in the soil test are off the scale because they've used so much. So practice a little bit of benign neglect with your worms. It's okay to feed them a couple times a week if you want. Toss them an apple core if you have a small bin. Throw some uh, leftover cabbage leaves in there, shred it up. If you found a couple of shriveled up, plums in your bin in your refrigerator, that's fine. Add them in there, but don't overfeed them. So you don't want to give them tons of stuff every single night unless you have a really big bin. So just remember, you want to not overfeed your worms, just like you don't want to overfeed yourself or your kids. Remember to keep adding in bedding. You don't want to have a really thick, heavily, holding a lot of moisture. Again, after you've had worms for a little bit, you will know when you look at it, oh, I need to go ahead and swap this bedding out because these worms are, this is perfect. This will be great for my plants. You want to keep that worm bedding moist, but not too moist. So again, 60 to 80% moisture, that's a good range to kind of aim for. Don't let them freeze. If it's supposed to be super cold and they're on your porch, bring them in your garage or your basement. They will die, and then you'll be back to square one. And be sensitive to big changes in the worm box. So the pot worms, you saw those, but there are other things that will go in there and live. So if you have it on a screen porch, that's fine. You don't have to worry as much. But if it's not a screen porch, you may get soldier fly larvae. So my chickens love soldier fly larvae. I have some of those that show up in my other compost bin, but they're kind of horrifying. So if you don't realize they're in there, and they tend to come in when it's a little too moist. That just as an aside, soldier fly larvae love to live in septic tanks. So if you have a pump out, you probably have a ton of soldier fly larvae in there. They're not bad. They're composters. You will get soldier fly larvae in your worm bin. So they look like really big maggots. They're kind of gross, but they're just doing their job. So if you see those guys, know that it's too moist in that worm box. If you see the pot worms, know that your pH is off, that it's too moist in there. So you've got to do some things to kind of adjust that. So just kind of peek on them every so often and just be sensitive to that. And don't let your worms overpopulate because, why not share? I've shared worms out of my worm box a ton of times. And sometimes people love them, they keep doing it, they think it's great. Sometimes they don't want to deal with it and they dump them out in their garden and they're like, I'm done with it. But either way, I mean, share them with your friends and family. So these are some resources that you can use. NC State has a really good vermicomposting website that gives you all sorts of good information on that. And then if you want to build your own worm tower, there's tons of resources online that you can use to find to do that. Like I said, DIY, no need to get fancy unless you have a common area and you don't want it to look like it was homemade and you prefer something that looks a little better. But this will show you how the Permaculture Research Institute, they'll show you how to make a decent worm tower. And then making composting tea. I gave you the recipe, but here you can go here and get more information on that. So lots of good information here. And again, this is being recorded, and so I try to do twice a month programs like this where we last about an hour, all sorts of different topics. This one is one I've talked about before, but it could be anything. And, I'm doing a container garden one in a couple weeks. And, I've done nuisance wildlife, I've done deer management, I've done snakes. So it could be something about just natural resources in general. It could be something I'm doing. I think I have a new one coming, bioluminescence in nature. So, we have, I think it's a new petunia that's out that kind of glows in the dark. But there's a lot of plants out there that will use that along with animals So lots of different stuff. So I encourage you to come tune in. And for the master gardeners that are out there, you get to count this as an hour of continuing education. So like I said, I provide 2 per month. So you should be able to get your 10 hours without too much of a problem. And because I record these, that YouTube channel, Metro Master Gardener, that's where they will be housed after this. And if you want the slide deck for this, you can always reach out to me at my email address there. If you want to reach out on my UGA email address, it's my name, just like you see it there at uga.edu. Either way, I answer both emails. And if you want to check out the other classes, you can see what I have there. Sign up for other classes and events. And you can see what's coming up. All right, so if anybody has questions, you can type them into the chat box and I will answer those. So I see, are red wigglers native to Georgia, or do you recommend a different type? I just recommend the red wigglers just because of how they, I'm not sure if you caught that first part. I saw lots of people kept getting knocked off and then having to come back on. Red wrigglers are epigeic, which means that they live in that top couple inches of topsoil and forest litter or duff that's up there, and they don't burrow down into the ground. So we don't want that because obviously they're not going to eat the stuff that's up on the top if they're down in the soil column. So the red wigglers are actually the perfect worm because they're easy to source and they live in that top layer. And so that's where all the food is going to be. Let's see. Oh, thank you, Lori. Are there any in-person events happening? I only see virtual ones. So we do have a Master Gardener guided nature walk up at George Pierce on May 23rd. I don't believe that's on there, but email me. That one's going to be done by Amy Mock. She's one of our master gardeners. And I believe that's, I don't have that in front of me, but it's basically your yard is a nursery for all sorts of insects and other things like that. So it'll be partially inside and partially outside. But that's going to be at George R. Pierce Park. That's Buford up there, and that'll be a walk and talk type situation. But I don't have any other in-person ones at the moment. Sometimes I'll do, usually more towards summer, I might have some workshops where we meet out at one of the parks. I don't have anything planned at the moment, but again, we may add something later. So just check back on the website. And let's see, do they ever crawl out of the bin from Linda? That's a very good question. Thank you for bringing that up. So when you get a new bin of worms, let's say that your friend gives them to you, keep that lid on there for that first night after you move them to wherever you're going to move them. Worms don't like that motion and they will attempt to escape. So here's a little story time. So I gave my mom a shoebox size worm bin with some worms. Thankfully, there weren't more than probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 tablespoons worth of worms in there. But I gave them to her and I thought I mentioned to her to keep the lid on, but maybe I didn't. I don't remember. Anyway, she put them on her porch and she set them on the side of her little barbecue grill. And the next morning she came out and she had worms all over her porch. So they are very sensitive when you move them. And she didn't leave that lid on and they crawled out, which is kind of gross and scary when you walk out in the morning and you see worms everywhere. It's even worse if they're in your kitchen and they're all over your floor. So thank you, Linda, for pointing that out, that for at least the first day or so after you move them to a new location, keep that lid on so they cannot escape. Good info. I may try again. Yes, definitely try again, Becky. Definitely try again. Does anybody else have any information or any questions? And you can ask things that are non-worm related if you're curious. That's fine. I'm happy to ask Q&A. I actually finished up before 7 o'clock, which is rare because I like to talk. So Anybody else have anything else? No? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, thank you all for turning in to watch this, and I'll probably put the recording up next week sometime. I'm off tomorrow. So I encourage you again, share if you're a master gardener and share with your friends so that they can get their continuing education. Anything that is extension related will count for continuing education. So even if it's not horticulture and it's about deer or something else, it still counts. So if you want to learn a little bit more about the natural world, please tune in. And if you have friends that are interested in learning different things, please tune in. I appreciate it. But definitely thank you all for attending. I'm going to stop sharing here. And I hope you all have a good evening, and we'll see you again soon.